The truck doors slammed shut, and the brittle silence of the Texas plains surrounded the Japanese female POWs like a heavy fog. But as they were led into the camp, it wasn't the horrors they had been promised: torture, humiliation, death that awaited them. No. The first shock came when the cowboys, eyes hard and weathered from years of hard labor, walked them to a small barn and pointed to a spot in the hay. One cowboy, tipping his hat, muttered, "She beds down here." They were not told to sleep in the dirt. They weren't shoved into overcrowded tents. Instead, they were shown beds, hay stacked in neat piles with soft, worn blankets. There was warmth, cleanliness, and a strange sense of care. This was not what they had imagined. Their captors weren't monsters. They were men who, in their own way, were showing them dignity, respect, even kindness. But why? That question lingered in the air like the sunburned dust that clung to their uniforms, as the women hesitated, unsure if they should believe their own eyes. The barn door creaked shut behind them, and the silence settled into the air like dust. One woman hesitated, her hand still on the handle, as if she might pull it open again and walk back into the bleak, unfamiliar world they had left behind. Her eyes searched the surroundings, taking in the clean hay that lay neatly in the corners of the barn, the woolen blankets folded at the edges of the makeshift beds. It felt like a trick, a performance, a cruel mockery. She could hear the faint lowing of cows from the neighboring stalls and the distant sound of horses shuffling. But most of all, it was the overwhelming absence of the harsh commands, the sharp orders, the constant vigilance that had ruled their lives for so long. The absence of cruelty felt like a betrayal. The beds felt like a betrayal. "Beds down here," one of the cowboys said, his voice rough but not unkind, as he pointed toward the haystacks. His words were casual, ordinary even, like this was just another day's work. There was no sneer, no derision, just a quiet authority, the kind that made their knees tremble in confusion. Some women whispered to each other in disbelief, "No, no, this isn't what we were told. We were told they'd mock us, make us eat from the dirt." Another woman spoke in a hushed voice. "I thought they would throw us into cages, make us beg. This, this is not what we imagined." The barn felt too warm, the hay too soft. It was the kind of warmth that curled around their bones, seeping into their skin, making their muscles ache with the unfamiliar comfort. They had not known comfort in so long. The last meal they had shared as a group was little more than watered-down rice and scraps. The last time they slept, it was on cold floors of makeshift barracks, blankets thin as paper and just as useless. And now they had beds, soft beds, with clean blankets, in a warm barn under the muted glow of the setting sun. One of the women, her face etched with years of worry and hardship, slowly lowered herself onto one of the hay beds, her hands trembling as she touched the fibers. The mattress beneath her creaked slightly under her weight, and she hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for someone to shout at her to get up, to tell her she was not allowed to rest. But no one did. No one moved toward her with force. The cowboy who had guided them in only glanced at her, his expression unreadable, and walked away. The other women followed her lead, though some lingered by the door, their faces tight with suspicion, their bodies standing rigid. No one dared to lay down just yet. They all waited for something, a sign, a reason to be afraid. They had been raised to fear the enemy, to believe that surrender was worse than death. And yet, here they were, treated not as animals, but as people, people with worth, with dignity, with space to rest. Their captors, the American cowboys, were the same men who had been painted in their minds as ruthless, savage monsters. They had expected brutality, mockery, the kind of treatment they had heard about in the rumors that circulated during the war. Instead, these men were giving them warmth, soft beds, a place to sleep, to rest, and to breathe. The psychological weight of this contrast was more than any of them could handle. It was not just the beds, the warmth, or the blankets, it was the profound disbelief that they were being treated like human beings. This simple act, this seemingly inconsequential gesture, felt like an affront to everything they had been taught to believe. How could their captors show them dignity? How could they be so kind? Were they being lured into a false sense of security? But as the evening settled in, the silence grew. The women lay down on their hay beds, one by one, unsure but too tired to resist. The soft crackle of hay under their weight, the quiet murmur of voices, and the distant sound of the cows provided an odd sense of security. For the first time in months, they weren't surrounded by the cacophony of war, there was just stillness. And though none of them spoke of it, they all felt it. Something was beginning to change. Something was beginning to unravel. But as the night wore on, the quiet comfort of the barn was pierced by memories, and the women's minds drifted back to the war they had known. They lay still, staring into the darkness, trying to shut out the images that resurfaced the images of a life before this strange captivity. For a brief moment, they were not prisoners of war in a foreign land. They were simply young women again, back in their homeland, where everything was different. The memory came flooding back, not as a single image, but as a sharp series of emotions, anger, fear, and shame. The honor they had been raised with, the values of Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai. To surrender, they had been taught, was a fate worse than death. The very thought was anathema to everything they had been taught. They had been bred for battle, each one of them a cog in the vast machine of war. For every one of them, the act of surrender was not just disgraceful. It was a dishonor to their families, their ancestors, and their emperor. As one woman, her face still marked by the scars of time and exhaustion, lay on the haybed, her thoughts turned to her training in the strict militaristic camps of Japan. From an early age, she had been taught that the strength of the nation rested on their ability to endure suffering. Each painful moment was not a burden, but a testament to their loyalty. She had learned to bow to her superiors without question, to follow orders, to suffer without complaint. And yet, now, all she could do was wonder, where had it gotten her? To a foreign land, half-starved and uncertain. And in the hands of the enemy she had been raised to hate. Another woman lay beside her, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the blanket. She too had been raised under the same harsh tenets of Bushido, where personal sacrifice and suffering were viewed as noble, even necessary. It was a system that valued death over dishonor. Their bodies had been molded for battle, their minds filled with ideals of loyalty, strength, and the ultimate sacrifice. But in the cold, uncertain silence of the barn, these values seemed foreign to her now, like echoes from another lifetime. How had it come to this? How had the war ended in defeat? And why had they surrendered? The decision to surrender had not come lightly, nor had it been made easily. The night their nation fell, the women had been told that surrender was inevitable, but it had been an act of pure survival. To continue fighting was to guarantee death. The empire had collapsed, and there was no longer any honor in fighting a lost cause. In that moment, when their minds screamed to resist, they had chosen life. But at what cost? Every woman who had survived that day now bore the invisible scars of that choice. The weight of abandoning everything they had been taught, the shame of survival pressed down on them like a physical burden. They had been trained to fight to the end, and yet here they were, lying on hay beds, in the hands of the very enemy they had been taught to despise. Their bodies were weak from hunger, malnutrition, and deprivation, but their spirits were far from broken. The war they had known had been brutal, unforgiving. The Japanese POW camps, if they could even be called that, were hell on earth. Starvation was common, and the brutality of the guards matched the dire conditions. Women and men alike had been treated as expendable. Their bodies worked until they collapsed, their strength drained by hunger, despair, and the unrelenting demands of war. But despite all of it, they had survived. Their bodies, broken as they were, carried the memory of their survival, something deep inside that refused to die, even when their strength had long since left them. They had surrendered, yes, but they had also lived. They had chosen life. And yet, as the night deepened and the soft breath of the cows filled the barn, a new question rose, something they hadn't expected. What did it mean to be alive after the war? What did it mean to be human again? Could they ever reconcile the choice to survive with the honor they had once carried in their hearts? And yet, as the days passed, the reality of their situation slowly began to sink in, and with it, a strange, almost unbearable warmth. The camp, which had felt so cold and indifferent at first, began to reveal itself in a way none of them could have expected. Hot water, blankets, food that didn't just fill their bellies, but nourished them like they had forgotten was possible. Each day, it seemed, there was another small act of kindness, another shred of comfort that made their minds whirl with disbelief. The first time they were given hot water, the women didn't know what to make of it. At first, they hesitated, each of them standing in line, unsure if it was some kind of trick. It couldn't be real, could it? The hot water was a luxury they hadn't known in years. The water itself felt like a forbidden treasure, like it might vanish the moment they touched it. When they dipped their hands into the steaming basin, it wasn't just the heat that hit them, it was the simple recognition that they were being treated like human beings, not as tools of war, but as people with needs, desires, and dignity. One woman, her hands trembling as she cupped the water, brought it to her face and splashed it over her skin. The sensation of the heat, the softness of the water against her worn skin, was too much. She couldn't hold back. Tears slid down her face, hot and unbidden. It wasn't just the physical warmth. It was the overwhelming realization that she had forgotten what it was like to be treated with care. She had been taught for so long that to show weakness, to ask for anything, was to dishonor herself. And yet, here she was, a prisoner, receiving something so simple, so human. Her tears weren't just from the water on her skin, they were from the shock of being seen, being offered comfort without scorn. Another woman, watching her, felt her own throat tighten. She had been silent for most of the journey, keeping her distance from the others, not wanting to show vulnerability. But when she was handed her own cup of warm water, her mind swam. She had been prepared to endure anything, anything at all, as long as it didn't break her. But the soft, almost tender way the American guard had handed her the water shattered something in her. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them to keep their pity, but her body betrayed her. She drank. The warmth spread through her, filling the hollowness inside. But with it came a deep confusion. How could she accept kindness from the enemy? How could she allow this simple human gesture to melt the ice that had formed around her heart? The warmth didn't stop at water. As the days passed, they were given blankets, real blankets, thick and warm, not the thin, tattered things they had been issued in Japan. The first time one of them wrapped herself in a blanket, she felt the weight of it press down on her like a promise. She curled into the softness, her body stiff from the constant tension of war, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to sleep without fear. She didn't expect it to last. Nothing had ever lasted. But when she woke, the blanket was still there, just as warm, just as real. For some of the women, the act of accepting these comforts was almost impossible. They had been taught for so long that to show gratitude, to receive anything from their captors, was a betrayal of everything they had ever believed. But as the days stretched into weeks, something began to shift inside them. The food, the blankets, the hot water, it wasn't cruelty, as they had been led to believe. It was simple humanity. It was kindness. And the recognition of that fact slowly began to eat away at the walls they had built around their hearts. And though it was still hard to accept, though the guilt gnawed at their hearts like an insistent ache, they began to understand one inescapable truth. They had been taught to survive at any cost, to endure pain, hunger, and suffering. But in this camp, for the first time, survival didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a gift. But that gift came with a price. The air in the camp was thick with the smell of something rich and unfamiliar, something the women had not tasted in months. As they shuffled into the mess hall, their stomachs twisted in anticipation, and their bodies, frail from hunger, reacted before their minds could catch up. The heat of the food, the steam rising from the trays, filled their senses and made their mouths water. But no one moved to take the food immediately. Their hands hovered above the trays, uncertain. To take, it felt like an act of betrayal. They had been taught that the enemy was cruel, that they would be starved, beaten, humiliated. Their expectations had prepared them for suffering, for punishment, not for the warmth of food, not for the simple luxury of a full belly. The food on the trays was unlike anything they had seen for so long: hearty stews, soft bread, and vegetables. One woman, her face still gaunt, looked at the beef stew with disbelief. How could this be? This was the enemy. This was the force that had destroyed their homeland, crushed their families. And yet, here they were, offering them food as though they were equals. It felt like a trap. It felt like a joke. "Is this poisoned?" one of the women whispered, her voice laced with suspicion. Another woman, her fingers trembling, gingerly picked up a piece of bread, inspecting it as though it might contain a hidden threat. It had been so long since they had eaten anything that resembled a meal. The bread was soft, warm, and the stew rich with flavor. It was more than they had hoped for, more than they had ever expected, and yet the guilt weighed heavily on them. At first, none of them could bring themselves to eat. The food sat untouched, as the women exchanged uncertain glances. They had been trained to resist the temptation of luxury, to deny their own hunger if it meant avoiding disgrace. But hunger is a powerful thing, and eventually, one of the women, unable to resist the ache in her stomach, reached for the spoon. Her first bite was tentative, as though she expected to taste something foul, something that would confirm her worst fears. But the moment the stew hit her tongue, she stopped. Her eyes widened. It was rich. It was savory. It was warm in a way that felt like home. And yet, it was everything she had been told to expect from the enemy. Betrayal, a symbol of weakness. Her hesitation was mirrored by the others, each woman taking their first bite with the same cautious suspicion. The stew was thick, the flavors foreign but undeniably comforting. There was beef, potatoes, carrots, and a richness that seemed so far removed from the thin rations they had known in their former lives. The taste of it was almost too much. For months, their bodies had been deprived of any comfort, and now, as they ate, their bodies reacted with shock. They ate hungrily, almost desperately, as if their bodies couldn't believe what was happening. But still, guilt gnawed at them. It felt wrong. They were being given food by the enemy, and accepting it meant accepting the kindness of those they had been raised to fear and despise. The second bite came easier. The taste of the food seemed to unlock something in them, a realization that this was not cruelty but care. They were being treated with respect, given the nourishment they so desperately needed. But it wasn't just food. It was more than that. It was a psychological weapon. The Americans weren't just offering them sustenance, they were offering them something far more dangerous. doubt, and as the last of the stew disappeared from their trays, they were left with an uncomfortable silence, not just from their hunger, but from the growing realization that the war they had known was far more complicated than they had been led to believe. They had been prepared for brutality, and yet here they were, given more kindness than they ever thought possible. The next morning, the air was thick with a new smell, one they had not smelled in years: bacon. The aroma seeped into the camp like a thick, comforting cloud, enveloping the women in its rich, salty scent. It was the smell of abundance, of a world untouched by war, untouched by the desperate hunger that had gnawed at their stomachs for so long. The camp, which had been a place of uncertainty and fear, now felt like something else entirely, a place of warmth, comfort, and luxury. But luxury, in this case, felt like a betrayal. How could they, the enemy, be feeding them something so rich, so indulgent? They had been trained to see such things as signs of weakness, as signs of capitulation. To eat, to indulge, felt like dishonor. The women gathered in the mess hall, each of them eyeing the trays with bacon, eggs, and bread, unsure of what to do. The sight of the bacon, its crispy edges curling in the heat, filled them with an almost overwhelming sense of hunger, but also guilt. How could they eat this? How could they accept such a gift from the enemy, from the very people who had destroyed their homes, their families, their lives? Their minds wrestled with the complexity of it all. To eat meant to acknowledge their captor's humanity, but to refuse was to reject something they had not seen in so long: the promise of survival, of comfort, of care. And yet, in doing so, they would be accepting something they had been taught to fear: kindness from the enemy. One woman, her hands shaking, reached for the bacon first, her fingers brushing against the greasy strip of meat. She lifted it to her mouth, and as the salty taste hit her tongue, something inside her snapped. She closed her eyes, chewing slowly, feeling the warmth and richness spread through her body, filling the hollow pit that had been there for so long. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot the war, the propaganda, the hatred she had been raised with. All she could focus on was the food, the warmth, the comfort, the sheer pleasure of something as simple as bacon. She had not known such comfort in so long, but as she swallowed, the guilt returned. It gnawed at her like a persistent, uncomfortable ache. How could she enjoy this? How could she let herself be nourished by the hands of the enemy? Her mind raced, torn between the undeniable satisfaction of her hunger being sated and the crushing weight of the propaganda she had been fed all her life. She thought of her family, back home in Japan, struggling to survive in the aftermath of war, with nothing but scraps of food and the lingering specter of starvation. And here she was, in enemy hands, being fed better than she ever had before. It felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. Her stomach, once tight with hunger, now felt full and heavy, but her heart remained conflicted. The others around her were struggling with the same battle. Some ate hungrily, devouring the food with quiet desperation, while others sat with their trays untouched, staring at the bacon as though it were poison. The room was filled with the sounds of chewing and the occasional muffled sob. No one spoke, but the weight of the internal conflict hung in the air like a thick fog. One woman, her eyes bright with unshed tears, stood up abruptly and walked out of the hall. She couldn't bear it anymore. She couldn't bear the idea of accepting this kindness, of eating what the enemy had given her. The others watched her go, feeling the unspoken tension between them. They knew what she felt. They felt it too. But despite the turmoil in their hearts, despite the shame that weighed on them, they couldn't deny the truth of what was happening. They were being treated with kindness. They were being given something they had never expected: humanity. And in that humanity lay a dangerous question: had their entire understanding of the war, of their captors, been wrong? In the end, the bacon was gone, and with it, a small part of their resistance faded away. They had eaten, they had accepted, and now they were left to face the consequences of that choice: doubt, guilt, and the unsettling realization that they might never see the world the same way again. The warmth of the meal still lingered in her stomach as one of the women, alone in the quiet of the barracks, sat on the edge of her hay bed. She stared at the wall in front of her, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and guilt. She had never allowed herself to think this way before, never dared to question the world that had been constructed for her. But now, the simplicity of the act, eating a meal, being cared for, being seen, forced her to confront something deeper. What did it mean to be treated with dignity by the enemy? She had been raised to believe that to surrender, to be captured, was the ultimate disgrace. They had been taught to see their captors as monsters, merciless, cruel, devoid of humanity. To be captured was to become nothing more than a tool of war, to be used and discarded when the enemy was done with them. That had been the truth she had lived by, a truth instilled in her since childhood. But now? Now she was here, in a foreign land, treated not as a tool but as a person. She had been fed, given water, treated with care, no mockery, no cruelty, no torture. The sheer shock of it made her head spin. She wasn't sure what to do with these feelings, this strange new understanding of her situation. The bacon had tasted good, too good to ignore. The comfort had felt like something she had forgotten was possible. And yet, in her mind, it felt like betrayal. How could she accept such kindness from the very people who had killed her comrades, destroyed her homeland? She clenched her fists, trying to push away the gnawing feeling in her chest. It was disorienting. If she could be treated with dignity here, if she could be treated like a human being, then what did that say about everything she had been taught? What did it mean for the war that had shaped her world? What if everything she had believed about honor, about the enemy, had been wrong? Her thoughts drifted back to her training, to the harsh lessons in the military hospitals, to the endless drilling of the Bushido Code. She had been taught that suffering was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the greatest glory. Her purpose, like that of all soldiers, had been to fight for the empire, to endure, to sacrifice, to obey. And yet, here she was, not fighting, not dying, but being given food, comfort, and care. The silence in the barn was heavy with this realization. The machinery of war, the endless orders, the drilling, the sacrifice was gone. It had been stripped away, piece by piece, replaced by a reality she didn't know how to comprehend. How did you survive this? How did you live when your entire existence had been defined by conflict? She had spent so many years preparing for war that the absence of it now felt like a void. There was nothing left to fight, no purpose, no reason. It was just the stillness of the camp, the kindness of her captors, and the growing sense that she was beginning to see the world differently. What did it mean to be human again? She had forgotten. She had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without the weight of war pressing down on her. She had been trained to think of herself as part of something greater, something sacrificial. But now, in the quiet of the camp, she was just a woman with needs, with a body that needed food and warmth. A woman who could no longer ignore the fact that her captors were giving her exactly what she needed: humanity. The questions would not stop. The war within her had only just begun. The day came when one of the American guards handed a piece of paper and a pencil to a woman who had been quiet, distant, her eyes shadowed with confusion. She stared at the paper as if it were a foreign object, its white expanse offering her the chance to write, to communicate something she had not been allowed to do in so long. In the camps back home, communication was tightly controlled, and writing home was a luxury no one could afford. But here, in the strange stillness of this camp, it was different. She was being offered the freedom to speak, to express herself, to say something to her family, to anyone. At first, she just stared at the blank paper, feeling the weight of the pencil in her hand like it was a tool to carve her soul out. She had been told, from the moment of her capture, that writing home was impossible. Her letters would never leave the camp, and if they did, they would carry only the official words of war, no true emotion, no personal connection. Now, the paper felt like a bridge to something she could not fully grasp. How could she begin to write something that felt real, something that could capture what was happening to her? How could she explain that she was no longer sure of anything, that the truth of her situation was not the nightmare she had imagined, but something far more complicated? With a hesitant hand, she began to write, the words coming slowly at first, the pen scratching against the paper like a foreign rhythm. "I am alive," she wrote. The simplicity of the words took her breath away. She had never truly allowed herself to consider her survival as anything other than temporary. It had been about enduring until the end, until victory, until death. But now she wrote those words with the knowledge that she had not only survived, but she had been treated with a humanity she hadn't expected, a kindness she had been taught to fear. The power of writing a simple act, one she had never thought of as a form of personal freedom, began to settle over her. With each letter she wrote, the realization of what this act meant washed over her. She was not just telling her family she was alive, she was reclaiming something of herself. She was giving herself permission to acknowledge that she had been changed, that she was no longer just a soldier, a cog in the wheel of war, but a person who had been seen, fed, cared for by the very people she had been taught to hate. But with that power came a moral conflict. How could she write the truth? How could she tell her family about the food she had been given, the warmth of the blankets, the care of her captors? Writing that letter meant sharing a reality that felt like betrayal. How could she explain to them that she had been treated better here, by the enemy, than she had ever been treated in her own country? How could she admit to them that she had accepted kindness from the very men who had ravaged her homeland, who had destroyed her world? Would they understand? Would they see her as a traitor? As someone who had abandoned her duty? Her honor? The letter was more than just words on a page. It was a mirror reflecting the internal conflict she now faced. The war may have ended for her, but it was not over for her mind. The battle within her had just begun. She was forced to confront the very ideals that had defined her existence. What did it mean to survive, to accept care from the enemy? What did it mean to be human in a world that had taught her to fear humanity? In the end, she wrote only a few more words before the pen faltered in her hand. "I am alive. I am safe." She signed the letter and folded it carefully. It was enough for now. The words weren't the end of the story, but they were a beginning. The beginning of understanding that survival wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about transformation. And the transformation was far more painful than anything the war had asked of her. As she finished, she sat back, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. The war may have been over for her body, but her mind and heart were still bound by the past. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt something that had long been absent, the possibility of change. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the camp was filled with a different kind of energy. For the first time in weeks, the women were not focused on the looming uncertainty of their captivity, nor were they consumed by the questions swirling in their minds. The air was thick with something unexpected music. At first, it was the sound of a banjo, its twang bouncing off the wooden walls of the camp barracks. Then the faint, rhythmic hum of a harmonica joined in, followed by the deep strum of a guitar. The sound of music was an intrusion, one they could not ignore. It was alien to them, a sound that did not belong in the world they had come to know. It was a sound of joy, something they had been trained to view as a weakness. Joy, they had been taught, was the enemy of strength. And yet, here it was, rising from the mouths and hands of the very people they had been taught to fear. The cowboys, their rough faces softened in the glow of the campfire, were playing songs, their voices rough but warm, spilling out old cowboy tunes that were full of freedom, of life, of simplicity. The women stood in a group, unsure of how to react. They were not used to such moments, not used to the idea of joy being offered so freely, so without agenda. They had always associated laughter and music with the enemy as something to mock, to despise, to fear. But as the music swirled around them, something inside each of them stirred a strange, unfamiliar pull. It was the first real moment of peace they had felt since their capture, a peace that came not from silence or the absence of danger, but from the simple joy of music. For a moment, no one spoke. They watched the cowboys, their fingers dancing across strings, their faces lit with an almost childlike joy. Then, one of the women let out a soft laugh, almost a gasp, a burst of air that surprised her. It wasn't the forced laughter of a war-torn mind, nor was it the nervous laughter of someone afraid to show weakness. It was genuine. It was real. It was a laugh that came from deep inside, from a place long buried by fear and suffering. The sound of that first laugh broke the tension in the air like a crack in a dam. It was followed by another, then another. Soon, the women were laughing together, quietly at first. Unsure, tentative, but the laughter began to build. It was raw, unguarded, and full of emotion. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all. The fact that they were here, listening to the enemy's music, caught in a moment of peace that seemed impossible. Others laughed at the joy of finally feeling something other than fear, something that didn't involve survival or loss. As they laughed, something in them began to shift. The music was no longer just a background noise. It was a salve for their wounds, a balm for the deep psychological scars they carried. It was the first taste of healing they had encountered since their capture, and it was both frightening and comforting. They were learning, slowly, that their captors were not the monsters they had been told they were. This was not some cruel trick, some plot to break them. This laughter, this music, was a sign that they were being allowed to heal, and perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a beginning. If you are enjoying this story, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot. Days passed, and the feeling of the camp, the warmth, the laughter, the unexpected kindness began to take root in their hearts. The women started to find some semblance of peace in the rhythm of their days. The work, though hard, was no longer just a means of survival. It was a way to regain their humanity, to feel useful again. But for one woman, there was something else weighing on her mind. The letter she had written, the words she had carefully penned to her family, now seemed heavier with each passing day. She had written it in haste, a small cry for connection, a simple reassurance that she was alive. But in those words, something profound had slipped through. It wasn't the contents of the letter itself that caused the stir. After all, she had only written a few short lines. I am alive. I am safe. The food is plentiful, and they have treated me with kindness. But it was the implications of those words, the soft, unexpected kindness of her captors, that caused a ripple far beyond the camp. The letter, like so many others, was intercepted by Japanese intelligence who, despite the ceasefire, still monitored the communication of their prisoners. When the letter was read in Tokyo, it sent shockwaves through the ranks. The simplicity of the words was deceiving. To the eyes of the Japanese military leadership, the letter was a betrayal. Here was one of their own, captured, writing not about the atrocities she had suffered, but about food, warmth, and the unexpected humanity of the American captors. The very words that had comforted the woman in the camp were now a symbol of something far more dangerous: doubt. Her simple act of writing had the potential to undermine everything they had been taught to believe. The propaganda, the years of training that had painted the Americans as ruthless monsters, was now crumbling under the weight of this small, seemingly insignificant letter. In Tokyo, the response was swift, yet confused. Japanese intelligence officers, trained to understand the psychology of war and propaganda, were baffled. They had never expected such a report. They had expected stories of mistreatment, of hunger, of brutal conditions that would fuel the fire of hatred and loyalty to the empire. But this letter, so full of basic, simple comforts, seemed to turn the entire narrative on its head. It suggested a reality they were unwilling to accept, that the enemy might not be the monsters they had been told to hate, but something far more complex. The internal conflict that had plagued the POWs now began to surface on a national scale. If this woman's experience was true, then everything the Empire had taught them was a lie. The soldiers had been fed a steady diet of hate, and this letter was a bitter pill to swallow. Back in the camp, the women were unaware of the uproar their words had caused, but the letter had begun to shape their own thoughts in ways they hadn't anticipated. Each of them had written, or considered writing, letters to their families, but none had dared to speak the full truth. To write about the kindness they had received felt like betrayal, not only to their country but to the war itself. To accept the kindness of their captors meant acknowledging that their entire worldview had been built on falsehoods. How could they continue to believe in the ideals of Bushido, the honor of sacrifice, when their captors were treating them with more respect than they had ever been shown? The letter had not only changed the perception of the enemy, it had changed everything they thought they knew about themselves. The days stretched on, and slowly the inevitable moment arrived. The women had been told that their repatriation was imminent, that they would be leaving the ranch that had, over time, become an unexpected sanctuary. For some, the thought of returning to their homeland was a relief. For others, it felt like a betrayal of everything they had come to understand in the quiet of their captivity. The ranch, with its warmth and kindness, had become a place of healing, a place where they had rediscovered what it meant to be human again. Now, they were being asked to leave it behind, to return to the world they had known before, one defined by war, sacrifice, and loss. She stood at the edge of the camp, her hand resting lightly on the fence as she gazed out across the sprawling fields. She had changed, in ways both visible and invisible. Her body had filled out. The gauntness that once defined her frame, now replaced with the soft strength of someone who had been nourished, cared for. She could feel the difference when she moved. When she walked, her legs no longer trembled with weakness, her back no longer stiff from hunger. She was healthier now, stronger. But more than that, she had found peace within herself. The constant tension, the anxiety, the fear that had gripped her since her capture had loosened. She was no longer a soldier, no longer a tool of war. She was a woman, alive, and her survival had become something more than a matter of endurance. It had become a quiet victory over everything she had believed in, everything she had been taught. The final days at the ranch passed in a blur of goodbyes, quiet, unspoken farewells to the cowboys who had changed their lives in ways none of them could fully comprehend. They had been enemies, but they had also been something else: healers, caretakers, people who had offered more than food and shelter. They had offered dignity. For the first time in years, the woman could look at another human being and not see them as an enemy, as a symbol of suffering or hatred. She could see them as people, flawed and kind in their own ways. She knew, deep in her bones, that this would be the hardest goodbye of all. Not because she would miss the ranch, but because she would miss the lessons it had taught her, lessons about survival, about humanity, about the unexpected kindness that could exist even in the midst of war. When she boarded the ship that would take her home, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been healed, yes, but she had also been transformed. The woman who had stepped onto that ranch, frail and broken by years of war, was no longer the same. She was stronger, yes, but more than that, she was different in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The war had ended, but the questions it had raised would stay with her forever. What did it mean to be a prisoner of war, to be treated with kindness by the enemy? What did it mean to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally? The answers were not easy, and she knew they might never fully come. But the fact that they existed, those questions, that internal reckoning, was something she could never escape. As the ship sailed away from the shore, leaving behind the ranch, the familiar landscape of Texas fading into the distance, the woman stood on deck, her eyes searching the horizon. She had survived. She had lived. But the war, in a way, had not truly ended for her. She had seen the collapse of an empire, the destruction of her homeland, and the humanity of the enemy. She had been forced to reckon with the fact that survival was not just about food and shelter, but about the internal transformation that came with being treated with dignity, with respect. And that, in the end, was a far harder battle than anything she had faced on the front lines. As the ship sailed on, she closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, "I will never forget." If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.